Patrick Henningsen talks on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to this live broadcast. We're in the second hour right now. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you for rejoining us. And right now, we're going to pivot to the international stage. And I want to welcome onto the program an international human rights lawyer. He has got a wealth of experience in this area that we're all focused on, have been for the last 8 months. What's happening right now in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Gaza, and all the things that have gone with it. The legal issues are abound. There's so many different angles to probe here, and also what's happening in the United Nations. I think everybody is looking for some kind of a solution, a ceasefire, some way to halt the hostilities, and then to try to negotiate some sort of solution to this. Stanley Cohen has been at the forefront of this conversation for a very long time. Stanley, thank you so much for joining us this week on TNT.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor. Appreciate it.
Stanley, let's just say, since this has kicked off, this latest round of hostilities after October 7th, you're no stranger to these issues regarding Palestine. And even with all of your experience, Stanley, how has this situation been so markedly different for you? And then from your perspective, your legal perspective, approaching this, because obviously you've been around the block many times, all of these UN resolutions, all of the different issues, but this is now taken it to another level since October 7th. Just tell us, your perspective on how things have changed.
Well, this is perhaps the most glaring example of Israeli genocide over the many decades that predate this and the many decades that I've been involved. And it's not just this glaring example of genocide, but there are two actors that have different political agendas here, which could stop it in a minute. You've got Netanyahu, who only cares about the 3 indictments that he's facing in Israel, who is only concerned about staying in power, who wants to completely destroy Gaza, turn it into another example of the West Bank, a different type of occupation than it's had for many years. And you've got Biden, who could stop this in 5 minutes, but won't, because, the person who likes to mourn and hug and kiss and touch and be warm to the entire universe and bless children and his son has absolutely no problem with what is probably 100,000 dead Palestinians, 60% of whom, maybe perhaps more, 70%, women and children, the elderly, the frail. Another probably now 15,000 that are being held hostage, that are being sexually abused and tortured. That are being interrogated with all sorts of violence. So what's different about this, and there's a third component, not before has it been so absolutely visible to the world community what Israel has been doing while much of the world has been silent and blinking its eyes for decades and generations. Not before has genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity been so palpable. Not before have Israeli soldiers been proud to take over mosques, destroy every school, destroy every hospital, assassinate doctors, murder children. Not before has it been so glaring, so brazen, so palpable. And it has created a situation for the world community that is much more comfortable when it comes to problems with the global South and just United Nations resolutions that go softly and disappear, and then people can go home and talk to their body politic about we tried, we did good, and things are going to go on. So not before has it been so calculated, so glaring, so indifferent, and not before has it been so focused for the world community, because it is the world community that must respond, because for generations, the world community has largely been complicit in giving Israel a green light. As long as Israel, they did their periodic attacks in 2006 and 8 and 14 and 21. The Great Return March, where some 30,000 people were shot, injured, crippled, and killed. Not a beat from the world. The daily pogroms in the West Bank, where so-called settlements are expanding and murdering and executing people that are political prisoners. So not before has it been so focused, so palpable, so clear. And not before has it come down to basically two political players. Netanyahu, who can stop this tomorrow, but is frightened about what awaits him when he goes back to the 3 indictments that he's in the middle of, and Biden, who could stop this under the Arms Export Control Act, under the Leahy Bill, and under various UN and United States laws. Forget about the United Nations, but it's completely lost. All he cares about is winning an election, so he's trying to walk a fine line between AIPAC and ADL and young people in the streets, and it's not working.
And, I also asked, what's different this time, Stanley? Is the flow of money from the Israeli lobby has increased a lot? Because even AIPAC didn't used to give direct contributions, but that, door was opened a couple of years ago. How much of that makes it factors into this complete, blind sort of lockstep march into the abyss over this disaster?
All bets are off. The subterfuge is gone. The secret channels of cash is over. AIPAC and ADL and the other Zionist entities and organizations, for example, there were testimony in Congress yesterday, which in essence reduced anti-genocide to blood libel. So you've got all the blinders are off. You've got all the Hezbollah. You've got all the rhetoric. You've got all the nonsense. You've got all the deflection. And as far as AIPAC is concerned, as far as the ADL is concerned, as far as the private tax-exempt organizations, such as the one that Kushner has and other Zionists that have been funding the West Bank sort of surreptitiously to the tune of billions of dollars for years, it's plain. It's out there for all to see. It's an all-or-nothing situation. And I've got to give AIPAC some credit. They have been able to, with mystical charm, been able, with the help of ADL, to convert opposition to genocide, opposition to war crimes, opposition to crimes against humanity as anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism for Israel to murder 100,000 Palestinians. Those are the Semites. It is anti-Semitism to destroy communities and villages and towns and cities of 2.5 million Semites. That's anti-Semitism. Young women and men and political leaders that are standing tall and fighting back against Israeli genocide are not fighting back against Jews, but genocide in the name of Israel and in the name of Zionism.
Yeah, so this is pretty unbelievable. I mean, I find it, I want to talk just a little bit more about the political dimension, Stanley. I want to get into some of the technical aspects, which I'm sure you can help us navigate. But the political dimension is, we're seeing this more and more, whereby, especially in Washington, that they're looking at this as some kind of war that they can win. And it's being framed in the U.S. in the media with, it's an Islamic issue. This is about, Christians versus Muslims, Jews versus Muslims. This is kind of how it's been framed in the conversation more and more. And it is a little bit disturbing because there's overt racist kind of overtones to a lot of the rhetoric that we hear, especially with Palestinians. Look at the student protests that we've seen over the last couple of months, Stanley. It's been framed as a pro-Hamas, Islamist, terrorist-linked student protest. This is the rhetoric in America right now. How can this be overcome? Because I find this to be almost impossible.
Well, look, the reality of it is, the last thing in the world Zionists and political leaders and the mainstream parties want is for people to focus on data, on facts, on reality. So they swing the anti-Semitism, the blood libel. I find it interesting that I don't know how many churches have been destroyed in Gaza. I don't know how many Palestinian Christians have been murdered, how many children have been slaughtered that are Christian, or how many Palestinians that don't pursue a particular faith. So what you've got is this desperate attempt to deflect the reality of genocide on the ground, of war crimes on the ground, on crimes against humanity on the ground, funded by the United States, without which it could not be continuing. So the way to deflect it is to get into this whole boogeyman of they hate Jews, or they hate Christians, or it's Islam. I mean, the closest thing to ISIS is Israel. When you begin to talk about religious fervor and hate, how often we hear the pogroms with death to Arabs, as Zionists, largely from Brooklyn, march through the West Bank, killing and slaughtering and destroying homes. Is death to Arabs an acceptable vehicle, a megaphone, being led by the very leaders that are in charge of the genocide? So it's deflection. The last thing Zionists, the last thing AIPAC, the last thing ADL, the last thing that Netanyahu, the last thing Biden wants to focus on, although every once in a while he squeaks out a comment, is the reality of genocide on the ground. Most recently, the United Nations again announced that there is clear evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity against Israel and various members of Hamas. We've not seen that before. Let's remember the Goldstone report from a much earlier attack where years ago, a South African Jewish jurist was assigned along with another American judge to issue a report on an earlier attack and described it as war crimes and crimes against humanity attributed to Israel. What happened? There were protests, his family was harassed, his life was threatened. So all of a sudden he does an addendum to the report that said, oh, if I only knew this, I would not have said what I said. It's that kind of bully pulpit. It's that kind of intimidation. It's that kind of deflection that is at the core of what Israel and Zionism and mainstream American politics has always been about when it comes to Palestine. It's the typical global North dealing with members of the global South, people of color, communities that are seeking self-determination and liberation, criminalizing them, making them evil, making them the enemy, and making them terrorists. 2.5 million terrorists, of which 90% are civilians, women and children. How many terrorists died today that aren't 1 year of age? I mean, it's the classic deflection. It's Colin Powell going to the United Nations, even more glaring, and saying there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And of course, there were none. All the boogeyman, all the deflection, all the rationale, all the hasbara is bull. It's crap. It's false. It's deflection. And as I say, Biden could stop it tomorrow.
I think you just hit on, there's other questions I want to ask you in a minute, Stanley, but you just hit actually what I think is, you probably agree, is the fulcrum of this issue. It's that all of this has been justified from the Israeli or the U.S. government or allied positions, has been justified on the basis that this is an anti-Hamas operation, ergo it's an anti-terror operation, ergo then we can suspend all normal, right to the Geneva Conventions, all norms can be, put aside because this is a terrorist problem and we need to do everything possible to, quote, eliminate Hamas. That's Netanyahu's mission. We need to back Netanyahu to eliminate Hamas. And now we're seeing U.S. commentators quite regularly coming on the news saying, well, we need to revisit this issue about the concept of Palestinian civilians. There are no civilians in Palestine. They're Hamas sympathizers, or they might be future terrorists. I've also heard this. I'm sure you have as well in the Israeli punditry, but that's the basis of it. And from an international point of view, Stanley, historically, is Hamas not an armed liberation struggle very similar to previous armed liberation struggles that we've seen throughout history? But because it has the designation, the political designation of terrorism, that changes the entire playing field on this. Your thoughts?
Well, let's keep in mind, historically in the West, the difference between terrorists and freedom fighters, who wins? Ask North American Indians. Ask Central and Latin American Indians who were terrorists. Ask them the question. It's interesting. I keep forgetting that Hamas is comprised of Italian immigrants, 18-year-old kids that get on a boat from Rome and go to Palestine. I mean, this notion that overlooks whether you agree with Hamas, don't agree with Hamas, like Hamas, don't like Hamas. Hamas is Palestinian. Hamas is from Palestine. It's not just from Gaza. It's Palestinian. It's a self-determination, a national liberation movement. The notion that implicit in what you've just raised is this notion that only Jews and only Israelis love their children. So, of course, Hamas doesn't love their children. Ismail Haniyeh lost his 2 sons and 3 sons and 4 grandchildren. And so, we throw them into the sacrifice. There is this notion that only Israeli Jews love their children, only Israeli Jews care about their families, and it's those cretinous monster Palestinians that don't care about their children, that don't care about their families. And the paradox is, Palestinians have an unbroken culture and history that's never left their land. It's been there for thousands of years, while the Israelis are European colonial. It's a project that's come in the last 100 years, let's say. The other issue that I find so remarkable about this, when we talk about the issue of a one-state solution or a two-state solution, is you hear the Brooklyn Kahanas say, Palestinians are going to want to murder us and slaughter us. They talk about the great democracy. They talk about liberation. They talk about economy. They talk about health. They describe Israel as this fabulous society that takes care of its people. But then they turn around and say, if we have a one-state settlement solution or a two-state, basically cantons like in Switzerland, that Palestinians are not going to want to get the best of a democracy, are not going to want to get the best of healthcare and economy, and are just going to want to go in and destroy. I mean, there's this arrogance, this racial arrogance that is at the core of the rhetoric, of the notion. Look, Hamas is a national liberation movement. It's led by Palestinians. It's comprised by Palestinians. It was voted into office by Palestinians. Whenever there has been chances or an effort to have elections with Hamas leaders or candidates in the West Bank, they've been jailed, they've been disappeared, they've been tortured. So this notion that this is about Hamas is ridiculous. Ask yourself a question. Could Palestinian resistance fighters dress up in Israeli uniforms, come across the border, go into Tel Aviv, where there's the Israeli headquarters, the IDF headquarters, and blow up and slaughter 100, 1,000, 2,000 civilians and say, well, we're on our way? Is it appropriate for Palestinians to engage in all sorts of armed struggle, what is considered illegal under international law, in their effort to free 10,000 Palestinians that are being, keep in mind, almost all being detained in military detention, uncharged, untried, unconvicted, and unsentenced, just held indefinitely under the great Israeli system of justice? So again, it's this, how do we deflect this? How do we explain our murder of 100,000 Palestinians, 70% of whom are women and children of the frail and elderly? How do we explain the mass destruction of hospitals, of schools, of infrastructure? How do we explain mass starvation? It's simple. It's Hamas. Blame Hamas for everything. Well, what happened in the 35 years before Hamas came to power? What happened with the original onset of the Nakba, where there was no Hamas? What happened with the 800,000 Palestinians that have been imprisoned and detained these many years? What's happened with the million Palestinians that have been removed from their homes, that have been thrown out of their homes, that have been displaced, that have been assassinated, that have been poisoned, that have been detained? Was it Hamas that did Sabra Shatila, where 3,000 women and children were raped? Was it Hamas who sent snipers to the top of the mountain or the hills to assassinate and shoot 30,000 Palestinians peacefully demonstrating? So get beyond the Hamas thing. Get beyond it. It's a Palestinian group. It's a national liberation movement. You can agree with it. You can disagree with it. And I've had this debate many times with people. It's not for the West to decide the manner and means or the nature and extent of resistance on the ground. That is up to Palestinians. And that is why Israel has targeted all of Gaza. Because despite the horrific conditions that concentration camp of Gaza has been left in for decades, despite that, there's been an air of self-determination, some development, despite the absence of enough food and water and medication, electricity, all of these denials of fundamental human rights. Palestinians would not surrender. And that's what this is about. This is about destroying Gaza. This is about displacing 2 million people. This is about slaughtering 100,000, mostly women and children. This is about turning it into an ash heap so that Israel can continue to build its walls, its condos, its settlements, while the rest of the world blinks and it takes generations to come back to where we are. It's no different than the Nakba. It never ended. It's just a different level of assault, and we haven't seen it before. Imagine what it must have been like during the original Nakba, when you didn't have phones and you didn't have the internet and you didn't have social media platform, where Israelis from Europe went around murdering and raping and throwing bodies into wells so that as they rot, it would displace and alarm other people. This is another extension, nonstop, of over 100 years from a racist colonial project from Europe.
And based on what you said, Stanley, the attack on UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, trying to paint it as a terrorist organization, and then the reality that Hamas is a permanent fixture in Gaza. When this war finishes, whenever it finishes, who's going to be cleaning up and sweeping up the pieces? It's going to be Hamas and UNRWA, isn't it? Despite what you're hearing from all these Western leaders, isn't that the reality of a post-war Gaza, Stanley?
The reality of a post-war Gaza is Gazans are going to continue to make their own judgments, their own calls. Yes, the world community is going to have to assist because the world community is obligated to. And why? Because it okayed it, it contributed to it, and there's blood on their hands. But the notion that either Hamas or Jihad or the PFLP or so-called lone wolves in the West Bank are going to go away is nonsense. You've got millions of Palestinians that ask for nothing else but freedom, liberation, equality, and self-determination. Israel is not going to make it go away. The world community is not going to go away. The question the world community has to ask itself right now is, now that we've been shown to be completely full of it, how we've been exposed as hypocrites, as take a look at the ICJ. Please stop. Nothing happened. The highest court for the United Nations. We've got the Security Council demand for a ceasefire yesterday or 2 or 3 days ago, which was almost unanimous. Let's see what happens when Israel thumbs its nose at the UN. What will the UN do? There's plenty it can do. The problem, once again, is the global north deciding what they're going to do, making decisions about how far they can go, and it's up to people throughout the world to say, that's it. And if the only response that Zionists and the Israeli lobby has is to call us all blood libel and anti-Semitic, so what? Call me what you want. My grandfather fought the Tsar. My father liberated concentration camps. I fight Zionism. Does that make it blood libel? And there are hundreds of thousands of Jews, if not more, worldwide that also, they don't accept the notion that Israel and Zionism and Judaism are one. They don't accept the legitimacy of the Israeli state. They don't support its nonstop genocide, and they're going to fight back. And so while Congress and university presidents and political talkers in Israel call it anti-Semitism, yes, it's anti-Semitism to kill, to maim, and destroy Palestine. That's anti-Semitism.
And also, just you mentioned the United Nations Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. What do you make of this recent move? Do you think this is perhaps a ploy by the U.S. to buy time or to appear to be, doing something positive in an election year? Is this a genuine move at the Security Council level?
It's a feel-good move at this point. What should have happened and what can still happen is the Security Council can send a message to Israel. Keep in mind, there's still the question of the arrest warrants being issued for war crimes and crimes against humanity against the top leadership, including Netanyahu of Israel. What the United Nations should have done and needs to do is send a message to Israel. If you don't agree with this, we're going to permit the General Assembly to vote to suspend you. We're going to remove you from positions of authority. We're going to take you off of committees. We're going to designate you as a pariah. That type of messaging then sends a message to corporations, to businesses, to individual donors that lets them know, if you continue to fund, to contribute, to work with the Zionist entity in Israel, if you continue to support the genocide that's going on, you too are culpable. And under international law, now that you're on notice about war crimes, crimes against humanity, about the ICJ call that there's a palpable case of genocide underway, and now that there's been a demand for a ceasefire, for those non-state actors and states that continue to fund, to participate, and to support the genocide, it puts them on notice that they too can be held accountable. But the UN didn't do that. The Security Council didn't do it. They walked away. They felt good. They went to the local restaurants. Joe Biden got out and said, "You see, I'm with you. You're my brothers and your sisters, etc." The real question is, Israel is not going to stop. How many kids and women did they murder today? How many doctors did they assassinate today? How much humanitarian aid was permitted to come in through Rafah that Israel is controlling at this point? It feels good, but there has to come a time when people who are voting, when people are weighing in and taking a position on genocide, have to show some determination, some focus, and some enforcement. What are they going to do when Israel says screw you? Because it's going to say screw you. Because it's clear Netanyahu, as long as Netanyahu is killing, slaughtering, and destroying those criminal charges, those 3 criminal cases pending against him are just sitting on hold. As long as Netanyahu can continue to say hostage, 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 he continues the genocide. His goal is clear. His goal from day one has been simple: the complete destruction of Gaza, to kill 100 to 200,000 Palestinians, to displace 1 million or 1.5 million of them, to destroy their economy, their school system, which is in ruins, all their hospitals are in ruins, all of their infrastructures in ruins. And the world looks at this. And meanwhile, we see a story breaking today about how an apartment building in Ukraine was hit by a Russian missile and 10 people died, and the politicians are shocked over this.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's the scale of what we've seen over the last 8 months is unbelievable. What's even more unbelievable, Stanley, is there's people arguing, saying that it's not that bad what's happening in Gaza, and this is just unfortunate collateral damage in this anti-terror operation to eliminate Hamas. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of the conversation is, but I don't think it's going to remain. It can't remain there forever. I think a lot of these people are going to be dragged by their hair into reality very soon as this situation unfolds. Stanley, before the break, you brought up some important points. Obviously, the International Courts of Justice. This is the court where countries are taken to court, and then you have the ICC, where individuals are taken to the International Court. The ICJ seems to be very clear, and there seems to be plenty of evidence, more than any other case probably in history, and reasonable demands to the state of Israel. So my question is, by ignoring all of this, is Israel and the U.S. jeopardizing really potentially disabling the entire the post-World War II international system of justice, and including the UN? Your thoughts on this?
Agree with you. The paradox here is the ICJ and the ICC and a whole body of international law spun out of the Nuremberg tribunals, spun out of the Holocaust, spun out of holding German infrastructure persons, leaders responsible for violations of law. And the paradox that a whole body of international law, which was designed to deter and to punish people engaged in what Israel is at this point, but it's rolling over. It's doing nothing. Yes, I think you've hit it right in the head. The failure of the world community to hold Israel accountable, the failure of the United States to intervene by a simple phone call and say that's it, while they continue to provide bombs, rockets, missiles, tanks, and money, is essentially saying the international criminal justice system, the international human rights system, is there to protect white Christians, white Jews, or white people of no faith. When it comes to the global South, periodically there's been some token prosecutions at the ICC of people of color, but for years they have basically held these gatherings talking about international law, talking about justice. And yet when it really comes down, this destruction reminds me per capita of the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When you see that film footage of entirely destroyed, miles of destroyed cities and hundreds of thousands of dead and missing, that's what's happening here. If not now, when? Per capita, there has been more death, more destruction, more violation of international law and human rights these last 8 months than at any other time in the last 100 years per capita in the world. So I think you hit it right in the head. If not now, when? The notion that, within 15 days of a request for an arrest warrant, there was an arrest warrant issued at the ICC for Putin. It's taken 7 or 8 months for Khan to make the application, and they're still pondering it. They're still wondering, what are they going to do? The ICJ, which, as you pointed out correctly, involves disputes among and between states, the UN has the power to set up a tribunal. That's what they did with Yugoslavia. That's what they did with Sarajevo. So they can set up a tribunal like the ICC, which seeks to impose international criminal law, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The reality of it is you've got the two most powerful courts in the world, and you've got Interpol just sitting around watching, and you've got the United Nations, which supposedly was an outgrowth. And it's interesting because ultimately it's the United Nations at fault, because it was 1948 when Truman, interested in money and votes, decides, okay, let's set up Israel. And the UN says, fine, that's cool. They need a place to live. So go where they want to go. But you're absolutely right. The message it sends is if you're white, if you're Christian, if you're Jewish, if you're part of the global north, you get a pass. Just be cool. But you can't even say that anymore because this is so palpable. It's done irreparable harm to international institutions. A hearty cheer goes out to those countries in the global south that have supported the applications at the ICJ and the ICC. There are now 140 nations in the world that recognize the state of Palestine. Okay, UN, it's been recognized as a state of Palestine. I realize it's only an observer status in the United Nations. What are you going to do? Israel, once again, is continuing to slaughter, is continuing to engage in violations of law. There's the concept, and I wrote about it the other day, of perfidy. This notion that you are free to do whatever you want to do to quote unquote to recover captives or hostages. It's not true. Under international law, it's well settled under the law of war. You cannot put on civilian clothes. You cannot put on false uniforms, go out for whatever reason you claim is in the best interest, and along the way you kill 240 or 250 civilians. That's a violation of not just international law. It's a violation of U.S. law. The finding of genocide is also a violation of U.S. law. The findings of war, keep in mind that the United States has prosecuted people that they renditioned in ISIS and Al-Qaeda, dragged to the United States. They didn't prosecute them under international law. They prosecuted them under U.S. law. So what is this double standard? Where you have the power to prosecute people for genocide, you have the power to prosecute people for violations of perfidy, you have the power to prosecute people under the law of war and humanitarian laws, but you don't do it. And meanwhile, you're complicit. Meanwhile, you fund it. Meanwhile, you keep it going. Meanwhile, you're involved in these ceasefire negotiations where Israel always says, no, you got to give, you got to give, you got to give. And whenever an issue is inserted into the discussions that says, no, if there's going to be a ceasefire and if there's going to be an exchange of captives for hostages, captives being largely the Israelis still in custody, hostages being the Palestinians, then there has to be assurance that when it's finally done, Netanyahu just doesn't begin anew. And what if he does? And there are issues in the United States to deal with.
And you mentioned Hiroshima, Nagasaki. I've got a video clip here. This was just we just posted this on our X account recently. Let's go ahead and roll this. I mean, I know you've seen this type of footage, a lot of it, too much of it, in fact, Stanley, and we all have. But it's worth showing this particular clip. Let's go ahead and roll this, number 3 from Gaza. So my question, Stanley, is, Hiroshima, Nagasaki dropped in a day. What is the difference between dropping a bomb with that level of kilotons in a day or dropping 75,000 tons over the course of 7 months? The devastation's the same. The loss of human life is the same. The only difference is the time scale, as far as I can see. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary, breathtaking scenes.
Well, a fundamental difference in Netanyahu's mind, in the Zionist mind, is you've got this diaspora community of millions of Palestinians that are living outside of Palestine, that were displaced, that were forced out, that have moved on for whatever reason, millions. The long, arduous, torturous, day in, day out death and destruction is also seeking to send a message to the Palestinian diaspora community that there's nothing here for you, that you can't come back, that we're not going to allow you to have your nation, your state back. And with Nagasaki, it was this horrible, one bombs, 100,000 people dead, and then 3 square miles destroyed. Both had their rationales. Both are war crimes. Both are crimes against humanity. It's as much to challenge, to break apart, to create as much pain and suffering on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank and the diaspora community of Palestinians throughout the world that have to live day in, day out, seeing and hearing and talking and learning and trying to do whatever they could do from quote unquote the safety of another country, but yet seeing their families. I have a very dear friend of mine who's in the United States right now, who's from Gaza, and has been here for a bit. And her elementary school, her high school, her university, the places she taught, the places she worked, her entire neighborhood, her entire family, they're gone. What do you say to this person? What do you say to give some peace of mind or hope to millions of Palestinians also outside of that genocide, that there's a chance, that there's a future, that there's a tomorrow, that there's hope? If the world community can't do that, then tell me the difference between the world community and Germany in World War I and World War II. There's always rationales. There's always excuses. The Germans blamed Jews because of any number of things. The Germans blamed gay communities and communists and Christians. You know, they had all the excuses for why they were going to exterminate millions of people and not just Jews. And here we see Israel doing the same thing with the same excuses.
Yeah, it's as if, especially the European countries, haven't learned their lessons from history. Put the United States even aside. Germany's position with Israel is quite unbelievable. It's almost as if the Palestinians are having to atone for Germans' historic guilt right down to the last Palestinian. Great effort by Nicaragua to take Germany to task in the international court. That's certainly something that's quite inspirational. But Stanley, the other thing is, a lot of the conversation gets held up. You probably heard, the pro-Israeli voices saying, we see this all over social media, on all the news shows. Hamas just needs to release the hostages. And this will all be over. The horror will end as long as Hamas releases our hostages. But that's only one side of the story. We don't hear the other side, which is the Palestinians who are detained in administrative military detention, thousands of them. Tell us this side of the story, if you could, Stanley.
Well, let me say two things about that. And I know for a fact that within 3 weeks of October 7th, there was a proposal on the table that called for the staggered release of quote unquote captives or hostages, depending upon their background, in exchange for Palestinians, as has happened before. Netanyahu's Security Council, with a ceasefire, twice approved of it. And on both occasions, Netanyahu denied it. I know it for a fact. The quote hostage captive situation could have been resolved 7 months ago. No ifs, ands, or buts, but Netanyahu vetoed it. And why? Because he needed that as the talisman, as the excuse to unleash the ongoing genocide. There are 10,000 Palestinians right now. Now, I'm not even talking about from Gaza, who are being held at these secret military bases and being raped and tortured and starved, and doctors being executed. There are 10,000 Palestinians that are in military custody for political offenses, quote unquote, for voice, for association, for assembly. College professors in Israel, Palestinian Israeli citizens in custody. They are held. They don't get the same access to civilian process in the judicial system that Jews do. Held indefinitely, uncharged, untried, unconvicted, unsentenced. They can just in perpetuity. Thousands of women and children, the elderly, the frail, those with mental health issues. Now, the other thing that's got to be understood, yes, there clearly were people that were taken into Gaza that under international law could not be removed. They were civilians. But a bunch of people who were taken into Gaza don't come in as civilians. What you have to remember is under international law, members of the military, reservists, security, police officials, armed settlers, people that are involved in the military-industrial complex in that area are not considered civilians for purposes of the law of war. Yes, there were people that were taken hostage. As I said, Israel is still talking about all these civilians that are being held, when the vast majority of them, I suspect, are soldiers, are reservists, are security, are personnel. This is what goes on. This is what has happened before. The notion that, Israel takes the position, well, we can't go 10-1 in terms of captive or hostage exchange. No, but you can go 50-1 for slaughter. So again, it's a cherry pick of what we're going to do, when and where.
Yeah, it is. That's it always maintaining the upper hand, it seems, to basically spike any negotiation. We've seen this happen time and time again, sadly. But on the U.S. side, you mentioned the Leahy Act earlier. This incident at the Nuseirat, this massacre, which you mentioned before, 270 plus Palestinians killed in this daring, gallant hostage rescue operation, we're told, by the IDF with the assistance of the United States, in using this humanitarian pier. That's what they said it was, a humanitarian pier. The U.S. constructed the floating pier. And that kind of brings the United States directly into the fray in terms of war crimes, doesn't it? Not only that, the Israelis, as you said, Stanley, disguised as humanitarian work or driving an aid truck as they drive in. I mean, this incident has so much going on. I want to get your thoughts on it.
Well, you raise an interesting point, and here's the problem. Years before the Leahy Act is the Arms Export Control Act. It's an act of Congress that says, and there's a double standard, because Israel gets treated differently than everyone else who gets weapons or money. Everyone else who gets weapons or money from the United States gets quarterly installments and only upon certification that they are in compliance with international law. Israel gets a lump sum every year. They have not once signed an affidavit or shown evidence of compliance with international law, but yet they get the money, they continue to murder, the U.S. knows it, so they get the benefit right out of the box. The problem with the Arms Export Control Act, like the Leahy Act, is the courts in the United States have already ruled as a separation of powers issue. So the courts can't tell the president, do this or don't do this. It's exclusively in the hands of the president. On the other hand, Congress can freeze the money because that's their responsibility. But at this particular time, when it's owned lock, stock, and barrel by AIPAC and by the ADL and by Zionists in so many ways, that's not going to happen. The Leahy Act is very clear. The Arms Export Control Act. I've had clients, Palestinian clients, go to prison for violating the Arms Export Control Act because they sent 50 night scopes 20 years ago to the West Bank for security purposes. They went to prison. So the problem with American legislation, problem with the Arms Export Control Act, problem with the Leahy Act is while it shows some good faith, some specific intent on the part of Congress, unless and until Congress says, that's it, we're freezing the money, the courts can't do anything. And there's absolute discretion in the arms of in this case, Biden. And we know what Biden is doing. He issues an edict, and then he uses his executive power to send 5,000 new bombs. He mourns for pictures of children, says, oh, it's a terrible thing. He's got this cost ratio analysis where I guess he gives a certain amount of money in humanitarian aid. I guess they're now talking about $400 million for the reconstruction of Gaza. Reconstruction of what? Meanwhile, at the same time, he's given $4 or $5 billion for destroying Gaza. So you don't get it both ways. You don't have to give money for reconstruction if you're not blowing everyone up, if you're not destroying everything, if you're silent as he is. So there's this double standard, which is paradoxical given that we're now in a political situation where he wants to run for another term as a humanitarian, as someone who's concerned about the world community, who's concerned about peace and justice. Yet he doesn't blink at the fact that every day, hundreds of millions of dollars go pouring into Gaza in Israeli bombs, in Israeli tanks, who knows how much phosphorus and cluster bombs, killing hundreds of thousands and wounding how many Palestinians? It's Biden. Genocide Joe fits.
And also, the IDF have been posting videos throughout this whole this whole situation, this whole farrago of, shooting up Palestinian homes. We've got a video of this. We'll play it in the background here. But, basically going into residential buildings, homes, and gloating about it and almost boasting about blowing up buildings, blowing up mosques, and doing these sort of social media postings. Some of this stuff has ended up as evidence. Certainly, I've seen some of it with the ICJ early on, but it continues, even after that. That document was filed and all the evidence is being gathered. I think it's still being gathered, but we still keep seeing this. And it's almost like what are you going to do to stop us? There doesn't seem to be any disciplinary effort on the Israeli side. So this does lead one to think, Stanley, that there's kind of a loss of order on the Israeli side. They're not pretending to be professional, as they say, the world's most professional and, highly trained army and so forth. If you can speak to this, because no one's ever seen anything like this before on this level and happening so often. Go ahead.
You were talking about the grandchildren of the Irgun, the Stern Gang, the Haganah, the Palma. You were talking about a military structure where every single prime minister in the history of Israel has been a war criminal. We are talking about the grandsons and the granddaughters of Europeans that engaged in rape, execution, displacement, and slaughter even before the state of Israel. You are talking about the grandchildren of people that kidnapped British and hung them. We are talking about the grandchildren of people that engaged in an international mail bombing activity. We are talking about the grandchildren, the leaders, the framers, the founders of a military structure that was completely out of control, that simply just slaughtered, committed mayhem to deflect, to defer, to scare people. This is what you were talking about. Where have we come from, Saba Shatila? What happened with Sharon? Sharon was punished. He was removed from being the commander-in-chief and then became prime minister and engaged on it again. So we are talking about an unbroken history of out-of-control genocide, out-of-control war criminals, of people that think they are, quote, the chosen ones, that the world hates them, and that because that's a fact, they are free to do anything they want to anyone they want, including in Lebanon. How many times? Cluster bombs, the destruction, the death and destruction, torture chambers and cells. Ultimately, if ever there was an ICC case for holding accountable commanders-in-chief, holding accountable prime ministers, it's them, because the whole world is seeing what's going on. And yes, we all know about the criminal justice process and review system in Israel. I mean, after all, Rachel Corrie's case took 10 years, and the court said no case. You've got Americans that are being assassinated, Palestinians and non-Palestinians regularly by Israel. No one has been held accountable whatsoever. This is an out-of-control regime that has been out of control before the state of Israel was cut from Palestine. It has been out of control ever since. And as long as the world community permits it to continue, it will. Now, what can be done? People can be arrested. People can be isolated. It can become a crime to provide funding to the Israelis. It can end travel. It could, there's a lot that can be done by the world community. It seems we're able to do it elsewhere and to other people, but Israel gets a pass. And why? Because, among other reasons, it's been a really dutiful proxy for the West, in particular the United States, since day one.
And just a couple of minutes left, Stanley. I really appreciate your time and your commentary and your insights on all this. Uniting for peace resolution at the UN. This is a tool that has been used at least once or twice before that I'm aware of, whereby at the General Assembly level, they can override the UN Security Council. They can recommend sanctions or peacekeeping forces to Rafah or something like this. So that is a tool, but have you looked into this, and why hasn't anybody pulled the trigger on that one yet? Just before we go to top of the hour here, go ahead, Stanley.
Well, because ultimately these are political decisions. Because ultimately the Security Council, no matter what, controls what the General Assembly can do, and I've been urging it for 8 months, is to suspend Israel. Say, you're not going to sit in this committee. You're not going to get the benefit of being a member. You're not going to be able to participate in funding programs that we're involved with. Stop it. End of story. The Security Council, look, as we all know, was established to protect the political and economic interests of 5 states. And yes, there are people rotated in and out. I know there's been an effort and there's been some discussions, and I was involved a number of months ago with people about forcing the General Assembly to either try to override the Security Council or to take unilateral actions with regard to, the General Assembly. What the General Assembly should have done with the ICJ was go to the next step. They got a resolution. They got a finding, which was a palpable case of genocide. They should have taken it, and the General Assembly should have voted on a series of orders to be implemented immediately while the rest of the proceeding continues on. They didn't do it. Yeah.
Well, we're here. We're still here. There's still as late in the day as it is, Stanley. There's still a chance that this can be sort of pulled back, at least temporarily, anyway, from the brink. At least that the United States might apply the brakes to all of this. As you said, we have the power of the purse, other checks and balances. Normally, this would happen, but unfortunately, in the current political environment, with the power of the lobby, as you rightly said, it's created a lot of problems in the U.S. system in creating these checks and balances that would be able to be implemented to change this incredibly bad situation. I honestly think this is a huge liability for the United States internationally, and I don't think they realize how much of a liability it is going forward. So this is going to be very interesting how this is going to unfold, unfortunately, in the next couple of months, Stanley. But we really appreciate you joining us, Stanley Cohen, international human rights lawyer here on TNT, today's News Talk this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a great show. I appreciate all your work. Thank you.
Thank you. There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That's Stanley Cohen. You also want to follow him on social media where he is. We'll drop him any links with Stanley into the TNT chat community. And a big thank you to everybody for joining us this week. Really appreciate it, especially everybody in the TNT chat room. We'll see you same time, same place tomorrow here on TNT for a big Friday. Get ready. It's going to be powerful. We'll see you all there. State of the Nation coming up here. Stay on the network. TNT, today's News Talk. Patrick Henningsen signing out.